Alpine finished fourth in the end, beat McLaren.
Yes.
Quick in a straight line all year, starting to trade a lot of that off with wings towards the end just to get the thing to put in the lap time. Again, their fair share of unreliable. We talked about the engine problem, which they traced to the start in second gear at Singapore and in the wet, and then that blew, and then that had a knock-on effect almost to the end of the year.
Yeah, well, they had a whole load of power unit issues throughout the year. It was the water pump earlier in the year that had a massive redesign, which again was lucky that the regulations allowed them to do that, or else they would be saddled with a hand grenading engine for the whole of the next 5 years. Again, the power unit was kind of there. They just had to get these reliability fixes. In terms of its performance, nothing that you could see wrong there. But there's just something, that car seemed quite good, but there was always a feeling that they were just underperforming. So, there's that inconsistency of, what weekend will they be really good?
Yeah.
And, the car's sensitivity to different circuits, high speed, low speed, seemed to be the bigger issue. But they looked like they threw everything at it this year. There were constant updates. They seemed to manage that budget, manage the aero program. Updates seemed to stick to the car. Lots of options to run on the car. And, when they launched that car, it actually looked so much like one of my early season predictions that I sent it to one of their aero guys and says, "Oh, you've copied me." I wish they hadn't. I hasten to add no more rumours on that one. But yeah, that car looked to me like it was the right sort of shape and philosophy that was going to work. I think there's just a little bit of secret sauce that's just missing from getting that whole package working, which I think we've said about the Enstone team over a number of years.
Yeah. And it was interesting, I thought, in Abu Dhabi, how Fernando seemed to be, he was quicker than Vettel. He was catching him, but Vettel was going pretty well, but he couldn't get past him and really couldn't get that near him, could he? It looked like he was losing a little bit of downforce behind the Aston Martin. And I suppose the other point is going back to 21, where Alpine were with a very large, a completely different philosophy.
Yeah, this car was,
they couldn't take any of that through into 22.
Well, really. They could have. They chose not to. And they ended up with a very elegant side pod package and a really comprehensive floor package as well, which was really interesting. Again, you couldn't pick any holes in it. And I think you have to compare them to McLaren through the year. And I think it now probably transpires now that maybe the Alpine was slightly the better car, but maybe a bit less consistent, less reliable, but somehow it won out over the year. McLaren had their own issues through the year as well in lots of areas.
Which I think is amazing, actually, because I think if you and I had sat down at the start of 22 and said, okay, we know in advance, for whatever reason, McLaren and Alpine are going to be pretty good this year. Who do you think is going to finish ahead of one another? Both of us probably would have said McLaren-Mercedes, wouldn't we?
I would have put McLaren this year. If it was,
but Alpine did a really good job in that sense.
I would have had McLaren's momentum joining them in the top four this year. That's how I would have perceived it pre-season. Yeah. And it was surprising that it just didn't work that way.
Well, James Key has been pretty open in saying, we just never even thought about the porpoising issue, and it just took us completely by surprise, and we lost a lot of time when we realised where we were at, and that's basically coloured their year. And I suppose also, they did have some, Daniel Ricciardo's failure at Monza, he was points heading there, wasn't he, and a few other issues, but generally speaking, why are we losing all these colours going all over the place here? Is that happening by algorithm? The same... Same way the algorithm works, whether you get called in Parc Ferme or not.
I thought you had the Christmas lights on.
Yeah, well, it is Christmas. Why not? It's still sunny outside, by the way. And speaking of Renzo Piano, of course, he's the designer of. You can't see it, but the Shard building is on the skyline here, and he designed that as well as the Ferrari wind tunnel, which is pretty cool. But no, going back to Alpine, it's overall you got to say, wow, they did it, and they had a change in team principal halfway through the year as well. No, I think again, it's I think we're 2/3 of the way.
I always
through the year,
look at that team and just think, what is that last little thing that they're missing? And I think this year is the first year I felt that there's that massive commitment from the whole team, from the chassis team at Enstone, and obviously with the power unit, because it was so different, so new for this year. That you kind of think that there's finally the commitment to bring them up to the front teams, and I think they probably achieved it on paper, but really they were never really in the fight towards the top 3 teams, and as nobody really was this
well,
year.
next year, for the first time since 79, Renault will have 2 French drivers.
I hadn't thought of that.
And that's going to be either a horrendous problem, or it's going to be, wow, they're all heading in the right direction now. Who knows? It's got some colour, isn't it? The blue's nice, and it's a different team. They're doing things differently, and all credit to them for that, I think. So, let's move on to McLaren then, and your thoughts on that. McLaren, Mercedes customer team, James Key with his foot under the desk now, Zach Brown management, pretty good sponsorship packages. You would imagine they would have had a brilliant year, wouldn't you?
It was, again, you look at, it's very hard to talk about form, and we talk a lot about momentum in teams in sport generally. They seem to be getting everything right, didn't they? All the way up to the start of this season, and then bang, straight away hammered by porpoising and hammered by front brake problems. Yeah. Which you would have thought certainly the brake problems were utterly predictable. Obviously, they weren't, and they never quite understood. Yeah. They resolved it relatively quickly with some makeshift solutions with these titanium, beautifully fabricated brake ducts, then replaced later with carbon fibre and what have you. But their porpoising was by far some of the worst, and did seem to kind of come and go between circuits and even through races and things. Looking at the data, it was just hard to fathom what was going on. And they also had a car, I think we could probably say, because of Daniel Ricciardo's performance, it was just hard to drive. Even Norris was saying it's a hard car to drive. It probably was the faster car than the Alpine, but it was difficult to get the most out of all the time. And again, quite circuit sensitive. It looked like it was just kind of compromised throughout the year, and they're maybe similar in some respects to Mercedes in that they got the best out of what they had, but they probably need a bit of a clean slate for next year. Do you think a Mercedes customer team could ever realistically think of winning a lot of races against the I was going to say a championship, but let's forget about that. Let's say a lot of races against the factory team. Yeah, I think that's possible. And knowing the characters involved at Brixworth and at Mercedes, I think that they wouldn't get in the way of that. So yeah, I think McLaren could come back, as could any of the other customer teams, Williams and Aston, and win a handful of races in a season. I see no reason why that couldn't happen, and I'm sure Mercedes would love that and get behind it. I think at the moment McLaren remain the team most likely to do that in the short term, but they've got a step to make. To me, it's rather strange that they've, bearing in mind the technical focus they need to have, that they've now destabilised the driver situation by getting rid of Daniel, who was a pretty, consistent wingman to Lando Norris. Not that he really was happy playing that role, but he was nonetheless a sort of Sergio Perez to Lando that that they needed, and now they've got this young guy in there who obviously will lack experience, and that's another thing on which they now have to focus. And it's kind of going to be Lando, I guess, leading the team. But I mean, if what we hear about Piastri is the quickest thing since Ayrton Senna, so maybe it's all going to be a completely different story, and it'll be like Senna in the Tolman in '84. I don't know, but it's kind of an odd time for McLaren to be doing that, I think, given that technically they need to be saying we should have beaten Alpine this year. Yeah, I mean, it'd be lovely to have been a fly on the wall in some of the conversations about where they thought Daniel's performance was at, why that was, and
or indeed what they expected from him in the first place. Because if you look at how he performed against Sainz, he wasn't exactly going to set the world on fire at McLaren, was he? Yeah. What did they expect? But I think he was by far and away much slower than they would have ever expected him. Q3 sometimes, stuff like that. But who was making the decision to have a young driver come in? And a team that are on the cusp of matching the top three, but joining the top four. I don't think it was the technical department making the decision for the driver there. I think it was much more for sure, over on Zach Brown's side of the operation rather than James Key and what have you. But yeah, it's tricky, but maybe he will perform at the same level as Norris next year.